Welcome to the CivilNet podcast. I'm your host, Paul Vartan-Sukiasyan. We're going to do things a little bit different today. Instead of focusing on one subject, we're going to review a whole lot of things that are going on right now, all very important for Armenia's development and what's happening in the region. So here to help understand that better is CivilNet's political commentator, Eric Hacopian.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Great, nice to have you. So we're going to start with a story which might have the biggest importance and impact on Armenia in the coming months. So last week, President Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, announced that Armenia and Azerbaijan might be willing to join the Abraham Peace Accords, or the Abraham Accords. This has caused a lot of confusion because the Accords, as we know it at least, is a platform for normalizing relations with Israel. But Armenia already recognizes Israel, as is Azerbaijan. And in fact, Azerbaijan and Israel, as we have come to know, have extremely close ties. So what's going on here with these accords?
I think this, as you described, people's understanding of it is what I call the old Abrahamic Accords, which was about, it was essentially the United States incentivizing or bribing, or however you want to describe it, traditionally countries that didn't have a relationship with Israel to have a relationship with Israel. But that is no longer the case. The Abrahamic Accords are actually sort of a cover or a superstructure of establishing very specific U.S.-based and some things that are very much in line with U.S. interests, mostly commercial interests, set of relationships and set of agreements that are usually between the party and the United States or multiple parties in the United States. It's essentially the Trump administration's version of diplomacy without actually using traditional diplomatic means. That's why you have Witkoff, who's a real estate developer. So what I suspect what Mr. Witkoff is referring to is that they have probably made very specific offers to both sides. And I suspect that offer is not negotiated. It's simply put on the table, take it or leave it, which will involve great U.S. involvement in this region, probably taken over commercial. It has more of a commercial face to it than necessarily a political one. For example, taking over the transportation systems that are supposed to be opened up, taking over the construction of everything that's going to be set up between these different countries, the management of roads, things of that nature. So it's probably and likely weapon sales, which, because I think they don't want. There's a lot of weapons being purchased, especially by Armenia at this point, which they would want, the U.S.
The ones from India, for example?
Yes, that the United States to have a cut of that action. So I suspect that this is more of a commercial enterprise, and it is something that the United States is going to put on the table and say, you're in and you're not. And if you're in, then in essence, you get U.S. involvement, and by U.S. involvement, you get the umbrella of U.S. security structure because you have U.S. firms and U.S. interests. And if you don't take it, then you, one, fend for yourself or deal with the wrath of Donald Trump. So I think that's the Abrahamic Accords. People need to separate it from their idea of what it was before. It is no longer that. This is about a U.S.-based set of political economic relationships that are being imposed around the world. And this is not, we've seen this test cases in Ukraine and other places. Everything comes down to U.S. commercial and economic interests. So we need to understand it in that context. So I suspect that the reason Mr. Witkoff made the mention that he did is because proposals have probably been made to both sides, and they're waiting for the answers to that based on how they move forward. But I think that would involve far more commercial things than necessarily diplomatic or political things.
Well, that gives a lot to think about because, for example, Azerbaijan is insisting that based on the November 2020 accord, Russia will be in charge of things. And I sense the U.S. would not want that. So is this a breakthrough for Armenia?
Listen, if I'm guessing and such a proposal has been made, it's very highly unlikely for our side to say no, because first of all, we're in no position to say no to such things in a country like the United States on a matter like this. Secondly, it's the issue of the U.S. security guarantees that will come with that. U.S. commercial interest means U.S. security guarantees by definition. It doesn't even need to be spelled out. So if there's any scenario that makes aggression against Armenia in the short run nearly, politically impossible, I don't see this government rejecting that. So in that way, it's a good thing, because that buys us the year or two that we need to be able to have the full capacity to defend ourselves.
So some are saying, could it be a trap? Because it was Azerbaijan who was first floating this idea of joining the Accords. Or did they maybe wish too hard and they be careful what you wish for?
I think we can guess that they are very unhappy about this development because they wanted those Abrahamic Accords to be exclusive to them. So this is something that they're clearly not. They're not going to be happy about this because this was their the thing that set them apart from Armenia. So if the United States is saying that both of them are going to join these accords, which again are just a cover for pushing a U.S. agenda that has very little to do with Israel, is not something that Baku wants. So I think, is this a good thing? A U.S. security guarantee in the short run when we are most vulnerable, and something that prevents aggression over the short-term period is absolutely a good thing. Because in the long term, these issues will deal with themselves once we have the complete capacity to defend ourselves. So yes, in the short run, it's a good thing. We would need to know what the details are, but I think anything that puts the U.S. security guarantees in Armenia is a good thing above anything else.
Well, that leads to a third question, because how does this all relate to the ongoing Armenia-Azerbaijan normalization text that they've apparently agreed on, yet not signed yet?
Well, I mean, it could directly lead to that, or it could actually have the opposite effect. It could be that as part of this quote-unquote Abrahamic Accords agreement between the United States, Armenia, and the Baku regime, part of that is signing the peace agreement. But I don't necessarily think that needs to be the case. It could very well be that the U.S. is interested in what the U.S. is interested in for U.S. purposes. So that could be part of the deal, or it could be this is a standalone on its own that has nothing to do with the peace agreement. Because obviously, Baku will do everything possible not to sign that peace agreement. So it could have the opposite effect. This could actually be the out for Ilham to say, well, as the U.S., you wanted this, I'll sign this, but I have problems with the peace agreement. Let's let that go for now, and I'm not going to sign it. But the reality of it is, if he signs the first one and the U.S. security guarantees are there for the region or for Armenia, there's not much of a reason not to sign the peace agreement, because if aggression is off the table, the peace agreement gives him everything that he wants. What the peace agreement would take away is the credibility of an enemy that will no longer be there, and that he needs that for internal purposes. I suspect what will happen here is that he's likely to say yes to the U.S. proposal because they're all afraid of Donald Trump, and he's likely to say yes. But he might very well use that as an excuse not to sign the peace agreement unless the U.S. insists that that's part of the package. And I'm not sure if they will insist that's part of the package. So this could actually have the opposite effect, in which it actually makes a peace agreement less likely, because they're saying we're signing something with the United States and this other thing we still have issues with. So time will tell. It could be part of a package that makes it certain that they'll sign a peace agreement, or it could exactly give them the exact excuse that they need, because at that point the United States isn't going to care. For Armenia's purposes, if aggression is off the table, no one really cares if this thing is signed or not, outside of the prime minister and his team. If there's no security threat to Armenia, whether something is signed or not, especially given how horrendous this deal is, there's not going to be too many people crying about not having this be signed in Armenia.
But that would mean long-term there would still be no open borders. It would still be an essentially frozen situation.
Not likely, no. I think the U.S. role would be to open borders and to control those transportation systems. So you will have that, but in U.S. terms, not necessarily in peaceful terms between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
So we've seen the U.S. asserting itself in Armenian affairs lately. We had in January the Biden administration signed the strategic partnership with Armenia, which some said, well, once Trump comes in, that's over. But no, it seems like the Trump administration is keeping with it. It was actually mentioned in the Armenian genocide. While he didn't use the term genocide, he did give lip service to this partnership to show that it's still alive and it is continuing into this administration. But now we see Russia asserting itself as well. We had Lavrov here yesterday, and we had them also give their own nuclear options for a plant to Armenia, because we know Westinghouse from the U.S. was just here really trying to, this would be a huge commercial get. You're talking about commercial stuff. This plant could be $5 billion. So, and that would also mean that Russia no longer has that leverage of taking care of the plant. So what do you say is going on here?
First and foremost, the U.S. Armenia strategic partnership, which was signed in the last days of Biden, from what I have understood, was approved of by the Trump people before he was done. So people who say that wouldn't lead to anything are probably not being correct. And there's really nothing in the agreement that is contrary to the Trump worldview. So they have no reason to get out of it. So I never believed that this was a temporary thing or this was something that's signed with an outgoing administration. That's the first thing. Second thing is, no matter what the Russians say in a nuclear plant, the decisions in so many ways have already been made. This will be Westinghouse. It will be a U.S. firm. Going back to the first point that we were discussing, this is about tying down the United States into commercial projects in Armenia, and a multi-billion-dollar nuclear plant that's going to take 10 years to build is the best way to do that. And the Russians really don't offer anything on that. They don't bring anything to the table on that. So I think no matter what they offer, the decision has been made and it's not going to change anything, because U.S. interest, commercial security guarantees interest in this region today for Armenia are far more relevant. We've been down that Russian road, and it's just not going to bring anything to the table. And from a practical point of view, given the sanctions against Russia, constructing a project like this is going to be exceptionally difficult anyway, even if we wanted to do it. So I think they're saying it, but that ship has sailed, and this is going to be American, and it's likely to be Westinghouse.
All right, so to bring things home a little bit, we've seen a lot of tension in Parliament lately. There's been a lot of name calling, including actually from the First Lady, Anna Hacopian. That's also made some news. But in Parliament, we've seen scuffles and shouting and fights breaking out, which it's one of those things that I hope it doesn't go viral, because everyone has seen these fights around the world in Parliament. That always seems to get a lot of attention. But a lot of this is centered on the person of Levon Kocharyan, the son of the second president, Robert. So what's happening there?
It was a perfectly laid trap by KP, the Civil Contract Party, the ruling party, to make Levon Kocharyan and his dad. Levon Kocharyan is a member of parliament, by the way, in the opposition, who's Robert Kocharyan's son, the face of the opposition, because they want to rerun the 2018 elections for the next 100 years. So what they wanted to do is to make this a contrast between themselves, the much more unpopular themselves, and with a family and a person who is dramatically even more unpopular than they are. So what they did, and it's a trap that Kocharyan, the family, walked into, is to allow themselves to become the face of the opposition, which frankly, because of their ego, they're actually happy to take. It's like this mutual, it's like this dialectic between the two of them. So this was a well-laid political trap that Levon and his dad walked into. And because it's a trap, it's a fight that the ruling party will win every single time, because Kocharyan, as a political operative, is probably unredeemable given his ratings. So that's what that was about. And the rest of it is just a show. They essentially, it's a year before the election, they made Kocharyan the leader of the opposition, and he gladly took it. It's good for KP, the Civil Contract Party, and it's bad for Armenia.
That's exactly it. It just seems like Pashinyan's worst enemies are in a way his best friend, because the only thing that gives him credibility is just how discredited the existing opposition is. We really need to see some new blood get in there. Check out our previous podcast, people at home, where we talk about who those alternative opposition might be. But if will they basically have an agreement between Kocharyan and Pashinyan to fight this out again? It looks like we got this more of the same coming up. Anyway, I'm going to move on now to just along Armenia's border to the south. We've got this little exclave of Azerbaijan called Nakhichevan, and very little news ever comes out of there. And so the fact that something did shows that there is a lot of anger going on. The outlet OC Media reported that military officers there are complaining that their salaries are being unilaterally cut via donations to the cause of rebuilding Nagorno-Karabakh. That it's very patriotic sounding cause, and they are making sure to say, yes, we're patriotic, but we're not being asked about this. And what about all these corrupt people there and their money? So, what's going on here?
This could be a one-off, or it could be more likely a hint of things to come. What was interesting in the article is actually how low these salaries are. These are contract soldiers or lifetime soldiers that are making $150, $180 a month. To put things in perspective, special forces in Armenia, I think, make like $2,500 a month. So I think it tells you, given the wealth of the country and how much they spend on the military, how little they value personnel on that scale. So that was the one interesting to me that really stood out, is how little these people get paid. Now, this could be a one-off, some local general stealing money from his troops by coming up with this Artsakh rebuilding issue, even though there's not much to rebuild. If you've been to Artsakh, it's, at this point, Stepanakert is probably the second most attractive city in Azerbaijan. So obviously, everything that's going on in construction there is a massive money laundering scheme and a massive stealing scheme. So it could be that. But I think what we're likely to see, especially if the security situation, if the threat of war or aggression gets taken away or becomes less likely, and we're heading into a period of low oil prices, which we're already in, when oil prices are dramatically less than last year. There's going to be a budgetary crunch in the country. And he will slowly, the money that we usually spent on the military will be spent on massively building up local security infrastructure. Because this is a regime that's going to be fighting. It's going to be to set up an oppressive apparatus that can put down any revolt against it. It becomes about defense of the regime. Sort of set up these Praetorian guards of security forces, both in the army and out. So I think in the long run, in fact, he's much more likely to take money out of the military, at least some sections of the military, like normal soldiers, and put it into the oppressive system while the economy is declining and everything about the country is going downhill very slowly for obvious reasons, currently because of low oil prices, but in the long term because of a significant drop. Every year there's a 10% drop in oil production. So, and post 2030, according to the World Bank, they become a debtor nation. So he's essentially probably setting up a situation in which his number one priority becomes regime survival internally against internal opponents. And an army is not particularly useful to that because the army is especially a conscript army. We saw this in Armenia in 2018. How much of, there were actually soldiers that were part of the demonstrations. You need loyal security forces that are willing to kill. And a conscript army or traditional army soldiers won't do that. So I think this is could be just a small marker of what's to come. Or it could be just a one-off, some local general being a thief, which is quite usual and quite normal. But the fact that they're going to be having economic problems, budgetary problems, is a given, just because of both declining oil prices and both declining production.
I mean, if you ask Occam's razor, what's more likely? We've got a country where everything is being grafted, everything is being stolen. It's more likely it's systematic, but yeah, we just don't know exactly. So finally, I want to bring up an interesting story that hasn't really gotten so much attention, or at least as much as I think it should. So we've had India and Pakistan not quite at war, but there was a trading of attacks. First, a terrorist attack in India, and then India kind of felt like it had to respond and attack Pakistan. And the results of that are still not clear, but Azerbaijan has been very strongly tied with Pakistan. There's even rumors that Pakistanis sent some soldiers to fight in the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. And so that linkage has also kind of promoted the Armenia-India ties. Now, what we know for sure is that there has been a major reaction in both the mainstream press and the influencers in India about boycotting Azerbaijan for its very close support of Pakistan over this, and Turkey as well, because Turkish weapons were being used from Pakistan against India. Now, there are hundreds of thousands of Indian tourists going to Turkey, for example, every year, and they have said, we're boycotting. And now, whether that actually leads to people canceling or not, that's maybe a different story. But, we should be paying more attention to what's happening. So can you give us some insight on this?
Well, the tourism boycott, those are secondary issues, to be honest. This was a complete unnecessary own goal by Turkey to a small extent, and by Azerbaijan at a big extent, because Turkey can take a tourism boycott of a couple of 100,000 Indians. It doesn't make any difference. And they're a much more important country, a much more powerful country. Taking the Pakistani side, especially after this was started by a terrorist attack, would just enrage what is the biggest country in the world, and a country that's every day becoming more relevant, more important, and it's a country that's arming your neighbor. And what you're doing is they probably took what is an Armenia-India relationship that was far more transactional than people think, that it was essentially based on purchases and money, and they're turning it into an ideological one. Which means, from what I understand, weapons deliveries, they'll come faster. They have incentivized this, and no one actually believes that this lull in fighting is going to last, because there's a great appetite in India to really punish them. And all of this for the purposes of Pakistan, which, talk about a country that you really don't want to sacrifice your interests for. It's a dysfunctional mess of a place that'll never get fixed and has very limited capacity to help you. So this was an idiotic own goal, but I think what it allows us to do is to turn this transactional relationship into an ideological one. Within India, the big proponents of relationship with Armenia have always been the security apparatus and the BJP party, the Hindu right. And the foreign ministry has always actually been quite, let's keep things balanced. Now, the India position in Armenia will become far more ideological, and not just simply pro-Armenia, but anti-Azeri. And this is very good for us, and it was a ridiculous thing for the other side to do. They could have just shut up and said nothing, or helped Pakistan behind the scenes. But out of hubris and stupidity, they picked the fight with a country that is far more relevant, far more important, and could do a lot more damage to them than anybody else.
It's extremely true. We need to get ourselves working now on how to bring in these tourists from India to Armenia, because that in itself, that's where it can also pay off for Armenia. Weapons are very important in that, though in that case, we are spending money. We've got to also bring money in here too. We have quite a few Indians now around Armenia, mostly doing labor and basic work, but so they're not kind of the ones that are they're helping Armenia in their own ways, but the tourism money, that's a whole nother story.
Well, tourism is massively underdeveloped in this country. One of the reasons that any Indian first of all, Indians have a hard time getting visas to go to the quote unquote the most attractive places in Europe, and the Frances, the Spains, the Greeces, because of EU rules. So coming to countries like Turkey, Azerbaijan, or Armenia is actually middle way. So it's a lot easier for them. And the reason Indian tourists aren't coming here, because up until now, we haven't had a direct flight, and there's direct flights to other places. So you can actually grab that market. But then, as we know, tourism is vastly underdeveloped in this country and has much more potential. So yes, they will be open to come here. And you see Indian tourists, not just Indian laborers, but those numbers can massively increase. And given the small tourism pool that we have, can actually have a dramatic missing 400,000 tourists from Turkey that gets 50 million tourists a year means nothing. But you add 200,000-300,000 tourists to Armenia, that gets, in real terms, probably about 1.5 million tourists, has a huge impact.
An interesting thing, because I was just at a pub last night and ran into an Indian tourist. He's not here because of the boycott. He actually didn't even have Armenia on his radar. He was in Georgia. A traveler that he met there was like, hey, just check out Armenia for a few days. He said, our Indians would love this place. He says it has everything that they could possibly want to see. And he said when he was in Georgia, his hotel had 90% full of Indian tourists. He said, I don't know what they're doing, but Armenia has to do it. And as we got talking, we realized one of those things that Georgia's doing that Armenia isn't is direct flights. Georgia has 5 different direct flights, different cities all around. Armenia has just started perhaps a New Delhi one, which is a start, but we've got to really, he said, I mean, it's not even a matter of money. He said these flights will pay for themselves, even if Armenia has to go out of its way to fund, maybe they won't make money in the short term with that. Once you get it going and then a word spreads, he says Indians are also a very emotional people who, you're either their best friend or their worst enemy. So he said they are ready to embrace Armenians, give them tell them what's going on. It's just a matter of raising awareness. So just to close, as I mentioned before, Lavrov was here yesterday. Is this Russia trying to reassert itself, knowing that the United States has these different offers out there? Or, what can we expect there in the long term?
I think not much. I think what we have in Armenia-Russia relations right now is what's the ideal for Armenia to keep in the short run. The pivot to the West has essentially already happened, because when it comes to security, when it comes to military reform, when it comes to the economy, especially after these energy deals, if they get signed with the United States, the pivot has already happened. So once you've already set that pivot up, even the diplomatic pivot, look at the way the Armenia votes in the UN, there's not much point in antagonizing Russia. So once you've had the pivot table set, you come back and you try to keep essentially neutral transactional relationships with Russia on things that are not controversial. For example, technically, yes, we haven't applied to join the EU. And if that's a problem for them, well, we haven't. So let's tell them that we haven't applied to join the EU. Technically, we're part of CSTO, even though it means absolutely nothing. So I think people are misreading these small things, like the prime minister going to Moscow. This doesn't mean anything. This is just, frankly, not making the mistakes of Saakashvili of poking the bear unnecessarily. We do not need to pick a fight with Russia for other people's purposes. Russia is here. It's going to be here. Russians already know that this country is gone in many ways from them, from their camp. So they're trying to keep a segment, some capacity. I can tell you they will aggressively be involved in next year's elections, trying to push for people. How effective they'll be is a completely different thing. They will interfere in our elections. But I think this is this administration, and I'm very critical of them, I think in this case, being smart about not antagonizing Russia unnecessarily by keeping these kinds of communications and meetings open. Because there's still lots in the Russian capacity to create havoc here is immense, and it's not even in supporting political candidates or operatives. It's economic, it's energy. So this break from Russia needs to be done slowly, and needs to be done in a way that doesn't cause unnecessary waves. So if you need to pay lip service to certain things, that might upset some people or people who don't understand what's really going on behind the scenes, that's fine. As long as the primary pivot has been made, and it has been made, it's a secondary issue.
Basically, Armenia has to not make the same mistake that Azerbaijan made with India-Pakistan.
Yeah, I mean, the stakes are much lower because there's only so much India can do to Azerbaijan. Russia can do a lot more to Armenia. But essentially, you don't pick a fight that you don't need to on symbolic things. And there's a middle low level of Armenia-Russia relationships, and we should keep it as such and not let it become antagonistic, especially on petty things.
Well, that's good advice to end on. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Eric. And I will say a lot of this was optimistic and things to be hopeful for. People are really starving for that. So let's hope that things keep going in a positive direction.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And thank you for joining the CivilNet podcast.